about home inspection. It is, some of you who are new, the problem with home inspection and all of the verbiage in that section of the offer to purchase can be extremely complicated. And so that's why we like to review this section of the offer to purchase. It's on page 4 of the residential offers to purchase, but it's on obviously all the other offers that we use, condo and whatever. But if you want an inspection contingency, I always recommend getting an inspection contingency, even if it's just for a particular area of the home. So in the, let's see. In the offer to purchase, it's in the residential offer to purchase, it's lines 178 to 226. And excuse me. Okay. I've got all these things in front and I can't get rid of them.
We are able to see the slides. You just can't see them?
I can't see them because I've got, there's one, and there is other. Okay. So the most important thing I think to realize, and we still see a lot of experienced agents getting confused on the aspect of testing and inspection. The WB11 wants to make it very clear that they are different. They are separate. They are not one flows to the other, or any of that connecting. So if something comes up in the inspection and it requires testing, you should have had testing as part of your offer in the beginning. You cannot enter testing of anything, even if it's brought up in the offer to purchase. So it says buyer may only conduct inspections or tests if specific contingencies are included as a part of the offer. So you have to start from the beginning wanting testing as well as inspection. An inspection is defined as an observation of the property, which doesn't include an appraisal or testing or any other, well, they say other than leaking for carbon monoxide. If you get that in an inspection, that's an automatic emergency. A test, though, is defined as taking a sample of something, such as soils, water, air, building materials from the property for laboratory and other analysis. That is the definition of a testing requirement, and that is under the separate section of testing on lines 178 and 192. The seller agrees to allow buyers, inspectors, testers, appraisers reasonable access to the property. They cannot deny access by any of these people if it's already approved and accepted in the offer to purchase. If necessary to satisfy the contingencies in this offer, buyer and licensees are both may be present at all inspections and testing. So seller not necessarily is invited to inspections or testing. Sometimes it's very hard to keep them out if they want to be there. Most sellers will remove themselves from the property altogether during inspections and testing, and that's smart. Remember, an average inspection can be around 3 hours. Make sure that you prepare your buyer for that length of time, and remind the listing agent that it would be about 3 hours. So it is in depth and it does take long, and you should all expect that. Except as otherwise provided, and that means that sometimes a buyer cannot be there, or even the licensee cannot be there at an inspection. It is fine for the inspector to be on the premises and doing that inspection without the buyer or licensee or seller present at the inspection. A an inspector is qualified to be at the property without anyone else being there. Any contingency authorizing testing should be specify the areas to be tested. And a lot of people just put yes for testing, but they don't put any area. It has to be listed on what kind of testing that they are requiring. The purposes of the test: to determine if environmental contamination is present or any limitations on buyer's testing, and any other material terms of the contingency. So you have to say, is it for mold? Is it for asbestos? Is it for any other thing that you can think of, additional property, which Steph has put in here, components. So areas where you know that the buyer would like to be inspected right away. In the inspection contingency, many agents, especially in the past, used to put on those lines entire premises. It's redundant and not necessary and doesn't say anything for the offer. So Steph is reminding you to put on those lines 197, 198, any property components or areas, say chimney, or say, well, they give you examples there, roof, foundation, swimming pool. Things that, as you've seen the property with your buyer, that you and your buyer want an inspection right away on those. A lot of times a swimming pool is not in a general inspection because most inspectors really don't know what to inspect. So you probably need a separate inspector, chimney, swimming pool, or a chimney or a roof. So they're not under the general inspection. You want some experts in those fields inspecting. So buyer may have follow-up inspections recommended in a written report resulting from an authorized inspection. So if your general inspector went through the property and has recommended further inspection, then you can have follow-up inspections on those. Provided they occur prior to the deadline specified in line 208. And that's why you need to have a lot of time during this inspection contingency so that you can get these follow-up inspections in from experts in those fields. Buyer shall order the inspection and be responsible for all costs of the inspection. Do not ever put that ordering of an inspection, timing of the inspection, or don't ever pay for an inspection for your buyer. That's totally on the buyer's shoulders, and then he should just let you know what time and who's coming. You can give him sample names of different inspectors and phone numbers if you want, but you should not be ordering the inspection. It is, I skipped the part, but it is contingent on the Wisconsin registered or Wisconsin licensed home inspector. You can't have Uncle Bob doing it for you. If you do have Uncle Bob in, that just means that anything he finds defects are really not admissible to be used in a notice of defect. It has to be from a Wisconsin licensed home inspector. Buyers should provide extra time, and that's so important. Sometimes in the addendum AC, there is a provision in there that you can have automatic extensions of the inspection. I think that's a good idea. But if you're not using that and you're just using this part of the offer for inspections, then make sure that you're asking for a lot of time. Steph here is recommending 10 to 14 days. That's always been the ballpark. Nothing less, don't do a week. There's not enough time. The other thing that comes up, and it's right here in the offer, that the buyer delivers to seller a copy of the written inspection report dated after the date on the line 1 of this offer, and a written notice listing the defects identified in those reports to which the buyer objects, and that becomes eventually the notice of defect if you want to present it. So that report, even if there are no defects on it, clean house, wonderful, that report still has to be delivered to the seller after the date of the offer and prior to the expiration of the inspection contingency. Now remember, and one thing that we're going to be clear on is the distinction between using an amendment and the notice of defect. And as they say on line 209, a proposed amendment is not a notice of defect and will not satisfy this notice requirement. An email is not considered a notice of defect and will not satisfy this notice requirement. So using the amendments first, you want to get some kind of an agreement between the buyer and the seller as to what the issues are. They don't even have to be about defects in the proposed amendments. They can just be things that the buyer wants the seller to correct. And then they can also add defects in these amendments. But they're talking about let's negotiate, let's talk. And your value as a buyer's agent is very important here, that you know how to ask, you know what to ask for, and how to negotiate with the listing agent who's representing the seller. So use the amendments back and forth, maybe several times back and forth. If you finally get to a point where you're at a stalwart and you can't move forward, no movement is coming from the seller or from your buyer, then that may be the time to decide that this is a notice of defect. And it will have to happen before the expiration of those 14 days or whatever. So if you have it clear that you go back and forth with amendments to try to resolve any issues, and again, those issues don't have to be defects that you're talking about with an amendment. In your offer, you should have, if you've given your seller the right to cure, you should have the clause in there that if there is a notice of defect and the seller has right to cure, that the seller will get a licensed contractor, lien waivers, invoices, and all that. And I'll get to that paragraph at the end. For the purposes of this contingency, defects do not include structural, mechanical, or other conditions, the nature and extent of which the buyer had actual knowledge of or written notice before signing this offer. Line 210 is famous, and 210 and 211. It is something that usually comes as a surprise to a buyer's agent or a buyer who didn't read this section carefully. But say you take your buyer through a property and it has, say, some gaps up in the chimney that you're seeing, and it's pretty obvious on the seller condition report. The seller may mention that the chimney needs tuck pointing. You may see cracks in the basement foundation. The seller can note those in the seller condition report, or even if they don't note it in the seller condition report, it's something that you saw, you had actual knowledge of before you wrote the offer, before you signed this offer. That's very important. Now, some agents will modify this and strike lines 210 and 211, which means issues that they did see in the property when viewing it, or things that they saw in the condition report, can be used as defects. But if you don't cross that line out, or modify it in any way, those defects cannot be included in your eventual notice of defect. So make sure you have that clear understanding, because sometimes you can get caught up and put one of those defects on your notice of defects, and the listing agent will say, nope, can't do it, because you saw that or you were aware of that before you wrote your offer. Any questions on this?
Zoom cut out. You said crossing out lines 210 and 211 means what?
It means that you can use defects that you saw before you wrote the offer in part of your notice of defects to tell the seller. If
Yeah.
there's obvious defects that you saw during your showings prior to writing the offer, or if they were noted in the seller condition report prior to writing the offer, you cannot use those defects as your notice of defects. You have to have other defects if there are. So be very careful with these lines. If you cross them out, then you can use any defect that you saw prior to writing an offer, or ones that were discovered in the inspection. Got it?
Is
I
there,
I had- Go ahead.
is there a special form for the notice of defects, or would that get put on a, like, I guess it wouldn't really be an amendment, but I guess I'll leave it at that.
It would be put on a notice.
Oh, on
notice
the
of
notice,
the offer.
okay. That
Okay,
makes
and
sense.
you just headline it when you're writing, this is a notice of defects.
Got
So
it.
makes it a special for that purpose.
Okay, and that's because it's one-sided, so the other side doesn't really have to like sign off and agree on it, right?
Correct. It is
Okay.
one-sided, delivered by the buyer, saying these are the defects to which the buyer objects. And then they are listed so that they can be cured, because you're saying in your offer, if you've given the right to cure, that these defects can be cured.
Okay.
So
Got
this
it.
is actually really good to know if you're on the listing side to pay attention to these lines.
Exactly, exactly. I had a buyer's agent one time. It was my listing in Whitefish Bay, and there were large cracks in the driveway. And, so much to the point you had to kind of drive around them to get back to the garage. And I had mentioned them in the condition report, just that they were there. And so he sends me an offer, and he sends me a notice of defect. And one of the defects he's listed was the large cracks in the driveway. I think that was the only one he listed. And I said, no, Bob, you can't use that, because I mentioned it in the condition report and you definitely saw them, parking in the driveway. And he said, no, Joan, you didn't realize that on line 210, where it says defects do not include structural, mechanical, or other conditions, the nature and extent of which, you see that I had crossed out the word not in the offer. And I said, no, I didn't see that.
Oh, that's a sneaky one. Oh,
A
boy.
very sneaky one. I'll never forget it, and I use it as an example all the time. So make sure you read thoroughly the offers that you receive. But this is important, and it's something that has been used many times, and it comes up with a lot of questions and wrangling when it does. Okay, so now the offer to purchase talks about what a defect is, and it describes a defect. It is purposely a little vague because most defects are really decided in the court. So it says a defect is defined on lines 445 in the offer and 4 to 447 means a condition that would have significant adverse effect on the value of the property, that would significantly impair the health or safety of future occupants of the property, or that if not repaired, removed, replaced, would significantly shorten or adversely affect the expected normal life of the premises. That's the foggy definition of a defect. The definition of a defect for an inspector is a little bit different because inspectors can't talk about value. So that part of adverse effect on the value is left out of the inspector's definition of a defect. But most inspectors now do have a page at the back of the report which lines what they think is a defect. And those are, if you want to issue a notice of defect, those are where you get your legitimate defects. Any questions about that part? So let's talk a little bit more about notice of right to cure. In most offers today, buyer's agents are giving notice of the right to cure to the seller. That's good. It's an incentive to the seller because it means that the control of terminating the offer is in the seller's hands, not in the buyer's hands. So because we want to give incentives to sellers these days, since it's still a seller's market, most of our offers do have a seller shall have the right to cure. And it is also the default if neither is stricken, if not done. So seller shall have the right to cure the defects. And that means that once a notice of defect is delivered, and it's only when notice of defect is delivered, that the seller then has the choice. He has the choice to cure the defects as stated in the notice, and that means to cure all of them. He can't pick and choose. And he has a time frame, and so Steph has put in a range of 3 to 10 days. 10 is the default days. And usually it is the seller has 10 days to decide whether he can or will want to cure the defects in the notice of defects. And if that's true, then he has to cure them in a good and workmanlike manner. And unless you've put that clause in, that's all the instruction he has to cure them. And then he has to deliver to the buyer a written report detailing the work done no later than 3 days prior to closing. So that's if the seller elects to cure and tells the buyer that he is going to cure with a notice of defect. So buyer sends a notice of defect to the seller sends a notice back to the buyer saying they will cure the defects, and he has to cure them in a good and workmanlike manner, or more restrictions as it is put in your offer. It has to be put in your offer that it will be done with a registered contractor with lien waivers and invoices. The offer shall be null and void if the buyer makes timely delivery of the notice of defect and the written inspection reports, and the seller does not have the right to cure. The deal is null and void. Or the seller has the right to cure, but decides he doesn't want to cure, and he sends a notice back that he will not cure. Or he misses the deadline of his, say, 5 days or 10 days to decide, and you don't hear from him. That soon as he goes past those 10 days, he has told you he is not curing. and the offer is null and void. It's pretty much the distinction. And remember that the notice of defect is the final decision of the buyer. The buyer has seen these defects through the inspector in the property. He's decided that he doesn't want to deal with them. There's no more negotiating. The amendments have reached a dead halt. And so the buyer has no choice to say, here the notice of defects to which I object. Here's a list of them. And I recognize the fact that you have right to cure, so you have 10 days or whatever's in the offer to decide whether you're going to cure them or whether you're not going to cure them. So if he decides to cure them, the deal goes forward. All the defects are cured. The buyer has to send a list of what he's cured 3 days prior to the closing, and deal goes forward and closes. But the offer dies if the seller doesn't have the right to cure or doesn't want to cure. Excuse me? Do you have a question? I guess not. Okay, any questions about the notice of defect delivery? About
Joan,
right to-
Joan, I was just gonna say, I think the one other comment I was gonna make about this, and this is a common myth, or question that we get, is that, people are of the understanding that the work has to be, like if a seller chooses to elect to cure, agents are of the understanding that that work has to be completed prior to that 10 days, noted on line 218. That is not the case. It just has to be done prior to closing.
Exactly. Right. Yeah, Steph and I get a lot of questions regarding this. And feel free to call either one of us at any time if you're in the middle of this, because there is a lot of what ifs in this section. Remember amendments prior to, before you send a notice, try to work it out. If a buyer just wants out of the deal, doesn't want to try to deal with anything, then he could send a notice of defects to the seller right away without amendments.
Yeah. The other thing I was, right to cure is a really hard concept to grasp. And I think, just like this idea when you're explaining it to a buyer or a seller, is it just determines who has the power to kill the deal ultimately. That's really what it is. And Joan's going to get into this in a minute, but ideally we hope it never gets to this point, right?
Right.
So, all right, I'll let you continue.
Yeah, I mean, this really is the concept that you have put down. It is only triggered when a notice of defect is served. We don't care about right to cure any other time prior to a notice of defect. It has no bearing on the negotiating or amendments or anything. You can never have it triggered in an offer. Buyer determines, and this is her point, buyer determines who has the power to declare the offer null and void. If seller does not have the right to cure and buyer issues a notice of defect, bam, that deal is dead. And a lot of sellers don't want that. So a seller either has the right to cure or does not. It is indicated in the offer and defaults to seller having more advantages for the seller and more advantages for the buyer if the seller does not have right to cure. And that's why we're almost always giving the sellers right to cure in these days, because we want to incentivize the seller as much as possible and not I mean, if he doesn't have the right to cure, he may not even consider your offer.
Hey, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Okay, I have a situation where my buyer and seller both kind of want to just sell the property as is, but the bank is actually requiring an inspection to be done. And I'm curious, um, if the inspector finds something that the bank finds um unlivable per se, um, is there a right to cure with the bank?
Well, so it depends. I mean, did they put an inspection contingency in their offer?
Whose offer? The buyer?
Well, if you said the buyer and the seller have sort of agreed, did the buyer put an inspection contingency in their offer?
We haven't made an offer yet because the downstairs unit needed some work. So
Okay.
they just completed some work downstairs, but I walked around and the house looked good to me, but I'm curious if the inspector, goes through it. I'm just curious about the connection between the inspection and the bank.
Right. Well, the bank, their power is they won't loan the money if they don't get their way.
Right.
So their
Right.
request for an inspection is part of your buyer getting his money. So even though you didn't have, buyer and seller didn't think it was necessary to have an inspection, the bank does. As long as that offer is being financed by a bank, you have to follow the bank's instructions because that becomes part of the loan approval. So it would be.
Yeah.
So the buyer could not get a loan approval if he didn't have those inspection and the work done. So that's.
So now you're working out.
An FHA
Oh.
loan or something.
I was just gonna say, then you're working outside of the inspection contingency really, and that's falling under the financing contingency.
Right. And that will especially happen with an FHA or VA loan.
Okay.
They will have their own requirement for inspection.
Okay.
But that rules unless your buyer could come up with cash. Okay, any other questions? Jesus. We have put in here the flow chart for home inspection, and it's good to sort of have it handy. To save it into your document, but the part in red is what happens if there is no right to cure. And the different trails that'll take to go to closing if there's no right to cure. The blue part at the bottom is if there is a right to cure in the contract and the different trails that it'll take to go to successful closing. So you can print this out, you can save this, refer back to this. But this flow chart is a great reminder to help you get through this kind of difficult part of the contract.
You can find this on the WRA website. And I think we have it in our resources as well. But this is a fantastic tool.
Yeah, it'll really step you through it correctly. And it's good to show your buyer because when they're writing the offer, it is important that a lot of these things are in the offer to begin with rather than trying to get them after that. So in practice, remember no amendments versus notice of defect. Notice of defect comes when there's absolutely no more negotiating. But try to negotiate as much as possible prior to sending out the notice of defects, and it can take a couple of rounds of amendments. But you know, you can consider lowering the purchase price of the property. You can consider giving incentives. If you've not really resulted in compensation agreement, you could consider this as part of concessions. And the important thing is maybe in your offer to purchase, adding this right to cure paragraph is good because it'll protect your buyer so that the seller doesn't just do a good and workmanlike way of curing, that he actually does it specifically. And then the new thing that we are working with, and we will have additional contract training on this, using the addendum AC to bolster what the buyer wants and add more ways of negotiating and communicating with the seller and the buyer. But this is the paragraph. It's in the Global Library under offer to purchase, and then the title is right to cure. You can copy and paste this right into your offer. Seller shall have the right to cure in a good and workmanlike manner using professional licensed experts with the benefit of permits as required and in accordance with municipal building codes and generally accepted construction and safety standards. Scope of work shall be defined by an independent third-party expert. And then you can go on to say that you would like to see evidence of permits, invoices, and lien waivers.
Mhm.
So this is,
Questions?
I was just gonna expand upon this and just clarify for everybody. This is an expansion of that good and workmanlike manner language that's in the offer already. But just protects our buyers more, and that's why we would want to use it. Because good and workmanlike manner is pretty gray in terms of, you know, how something could be fixed. So this just makes a little bit more specific.
Yeah, but it won't work if you try to insert it after the inspection's been
Right.
done. It only works as if it's initially right in the offer, buyer and seller have signed the offer, and now this clause takes effect. But you wouldn't have very good luck trying to get it in afterwards.
Right.
Okay, so what we've done is we've gone through the 3 sections of the inspection contingency. First is differentiating between testing and inspections. The second is the actual inspection contingency. How long is it going to be? What follow-up inspections may want to be remembering what the difference is between an amendment and the notice of defect. And then the third part is the right to cure and what happens whether you give the seller right to cure or you do not give the seller right to cure. And that distinction is there. My advice, and I know Steph's advice too, is if you are some of your newer offers that you're writing, make sure that you and your buyer understand every line in the inspection and testing. You know, even line 210 where I said this one broker just crossed out the word not, and it meant that he could add the driveway as a defect. Those things are important. Those are things that when you're reviewing an offer as a seller's agent, you read every single line as well. So any further questions on this?
It's the hardest contingency by far.
Yes,
I was just gonna make a quick comment. This is Becky.
sure.
Yeah, so last night I got an offer that did have that entire premises, and I think we have to be like, just again, reiterate not to write that just because it makes a contract difficult to enforce if it were, just because we don't know what they're actually asking for. Like, what do they want that's different than a typical inspection? Is that correct?
It's correct. Plus, it's already says entire premises.
Yeah.
Right. So that, those lines are very specific to like, do you also want a separate pool inspection? Maybe a separate, there's some type of drain on the property that they wanted, something completely outside of the typical realm.
Right,
of-
right.
Right.
Something that may look suspicious, or say your buyer has allergies, and so they really want a moisture test in the basement and things like that, specific to your buyer. In the offer to purchase, line number 1 under inspection contingency, it reads, this offer is contingent upon a Wisconsin registered or Wisconsin licensed home inspector performing a home inspection of the property. That's it. That's entire premises. So you don't have to reiterate. And I've spent my life trying to get agents to stop writing that.
Yeah.
This
No,
offer is
It makes
contingent upon-
sense. It makes sense to not do that though, because it's not clear. There's no clarification there. It's like, well, I wanted an extra inspection. Well, you didn't write that, right? So
Exactly.
Another way I like to think about it too, in terms of from the buyer's perspective, you might want to cite a specific component in that line because you don't want to rely on the inspector to go ahead and call it out.
Yes.
Just
right.
know right off the bat that you want to have that separate follow-up inspection or separate specific inspection on that component. As Joan said, if something looks suspicious. So if you're looking at a roof and you can see that the shingles are compromised, instead of waiting for that inspector to call it out, go ahead and just write it in that line so that you can just order that roof inspection right away. So.
Yeah. But again, it is under good drafting. You as a buyer's agent, as I have in this last slide, your most important value is negotiation. Be able to negotiate for your client's needs. You want a win-win situation, but you also want to make sure that you are the one representing your buyer. Your buyer is not going to get into a property and finding things that they can't live with or were not aware of. So that's the benefit of being an excellent buyer.
Right.
Any other questions, comments?